I'm John Batchelor, Homeline Conference of Presidents, Major American Jewish Organizations, Iran. We're joined by Behnam Ben Taleblu. Ben, writing most recently for World Affairs, Behnam used an extremely diplomatic word, Iran's dubious track record. That's relevant here because we're looking at trust but verify. Remember that old proverb that Ronald Reagan used with Gorbachev standing nearby back in the 20th century? And that had to do with nuclear weapons, and so does this. Behnam is a member of Foundation for the Defense of Democracy's Rapid Response Research Team. Behnam, a very good evening to you. Trust but verify. At this point, what we know about the negotiations is protracted, but there is no clarity. Iran's record, then, is extremely important. Does Iran have a history of signing a document and staying to it, or how do they deal with something they've agreed to and want to wiggle out of? Good evening to you.
Good evening to you, and thank you so much for having me, John. I think that's absolutely correct. You put your finger right on the money right there. The last time that Rouhani was not president, but actually chief nuclear negotiator up to 2005 when Iran was conducting nuclear diplomacy, not with the P5+1, but with the EU3. It turns out that Iran promised to take the additional protocol, that's this intrusive monitoring verification mechanism by the IAEA, and take it back home to Tehran to actually pass in its parliament, and it actually never did. So it failed to ratify it back then, and it made its adherence to it voluntary. And if you look at the Geneva 2013 deal, the interim nuclear accord between Iran and the P5+1, all of the Iranian concessions are limited, but more importantly, they're couched under the phrase voluntary. So Iran is drawing from its same, to use a better word, dubious playbook that it had back in 2003 to 2005. And I think an accord, should we even reach one early next week or late this week, would face the same legal political challenges that the Iranian team knows how to pull and play so well.
Let me just ask preliminarily that what you're saying essentially is that the supreme leader is exactly that, and those who have speculated that Rouhani, that others are pulling the strings, that they better watch what he says, and he means what he says, and he says what he means, and has the means to implement it.
That's right. I mean, the supreme leader is obviously going to be pulled and pushed in different directions. Even though he is supreme, I believe that's a title meant to be taken rather literally. He is atop the Iranian political system. I think, in fact, he's been the best barometer on the nuclear talks. People always say there are very many factions in Iran. I've studied Iran deeply. There are many analysts in D.C. who study Iran. Despite the feuding factions, the supreme leader's hand has always been played out up to the T. The negotiations from November 2013 to now have had more to do with the supreme leader's red lines and directive for nuclear diplomacy than any other faction in Tehran, or in fact, the Obama administration's directive.
Can you cite any red lines of Khamenei? We know the ones the West has given on virtually all of them. What has Khamenei given up? Which red lines can you point to?
Sadly, and I think it's quite sad, Khamenei has actually added to his red lines twice in 2014. Initially, there was an infographic he put out. It had about 5 or 6 red lines. By October 2014, those red lines increased to about 11. Khamenei has actually increased his resolve throughout the nuclear diplomacy with the P5+1. And it seems like by the West continuing to speak with them, he keeps finding out that they desire a deal more than he does. In fact, Khamenei said this, I believe, in a speech in late March 2015, that America needs a nuclear diplomacy more than Iran.
I've been given the metaphor, Behnam, of the Bazaar, that the Persians, underlying all this, the Persians and the Azeris, are masters of the Bazaar, and they measure each other. They talk about it. It's routine for them. This is the bidding, the offering of prices, the selling at the stall in the Bazaar. Is that an appropriate metaphor for the Supreme Leader and the Majlis's approach to this?
Despite what some might say, that the Bazaar metaphor, the carpet merchant metaphor, being a crass metaphor, and you know, I'm an Iranian American myself, I think it's actually quite accurate. In fact, a lot of the nuclear diplomacy team that Rouhani has assembled, they don't have clerical or intelligence military backgrounds, as far as we can tell. They come from merchant families, and so they actually might be steeped in this grand Bazaar tradition of which you speak. More broadly, in September 2013, Khamenei outlined all of this nuclear diplomacy under the umbrella of a policy called heroic flexibility, where all the changes in Iran's position would be tactical, not strategic. And as you said, each merchant measures himself versus the other. There's a lot of measuring and testing. This issue of arms control, the most recent request by the Iranian diplomatic team in Vienna to have ballistic missile sanctions removed. The Iranians actually, all throughout November 2014, kept saying that ballistic missiles were off the table. Now they're bringing it on the table without actually giving the concession. They want the relief. So they've assessed a weakness, they've discerned a weakness in the side, and now they'll pounce. And to use the Bazaar metaphor, they'll increase the price.
And what about the question of what Khamenei, and what his followers will tolerate in terms of the deal? Given his track record, how can you negotiate? How can you anticipate that he will, in 6 months, a year, actually follow any of the deals that he's made?
So there's actually two problems. There's multiple problems with the deal as it stands, or if the deal will be based on the April framework. One is that if Iran actually complies with the vast majority, or if not all of the clauses of the deal, if it is based on the April 2nd framework, that Iran will actually have an on-ramp for a nuclear capability as opposed to a blockage of the four various pathways to a nuclear weapon. And those sunset measures would actually decrease starting after a decade as opposed to increase. So Iran would have a legal nuclear program should it follow this nuclear deal. But, of course, it could be subject to various factions if Khamenei feels pressure or Khamenei feels that the relationship between the IAEA and Iran throughout the implementation period of a deal becomes something that he does not like. He could very easily have one faction torpedo it. The IRGC is always a wild card here. They have given President Rouhani a wide buffer for nuclear diplomacy. It seems like there's a division of labor in Iran, if I had to assess right now with the Rouhani administration, despite many reports of what many have said President Rouhani is a moderate. In fact, executions inside Iran are up to Ahmadinejad level era highs. Iran's regional policy has coarsened. It has not softened. And that's all because the IRGC is now much more in charge of these portfolios. And should the Supreme Leader want to torpedo a deal a few years into it, should we get one, or even a year into it, should we get one, he could use these vast arrays of forces to do that.
Behnam Ben Taleblu, contributor to Foundation for the Defense of Democracy's Rapid Response Research Team. Malcolm Hoenlein, Conference of Presidents, Major American Jewish Organization. I'm John Batchelor.